We're doing chapter 7, Nationalistic and Endemic Terrorism. I'm Elvia.
Tyler.
Robert.
Okay, go. Alright, he's gonna start it off.
Alright, so nationalistic terrorism was introduced by Bruce Hoffman as the leading expert in terrorism. States that the basis of modern terrorism is by politics and strategy of anti-colonial revolution. Developed by former colonies, targeted audience, and security forces. Wise terrorists would actually seek sympathy from the rest of the world, so they wouldn't look as bad people. Anti-colonial revolts took place from the 1940s to the early 1960s, and terrorism was justified as being under nationalism. In Cyprus, 1955 through 1959, the United Kingdom actually claimed Cyprus after World War II and established Middle East military headquarters after World War II. Cypriots of Greek descent resented British control since they were seen as lower class people. Georgios Grivas, who formed the EOKA, developed a twofold strategy, which was gaining international sympathy, confronting superior British forces in Cypriot cities. The United Kingdom, who negotiated a deal with EOKA on February 1959, Bruce Hoffman declared that as terrorism being something that actually worked. The Battle of Algiers from 1954 to 1962. France began colonizing Algeria in 1830. The North became officially French by 1881 and started giving the French citizenships after 1889. Some Algerians benefited, but the majority resented the French and formed a patriotic association to free their homeland. France would not retreat from Algeria, so they started revolting against them. They were considered part of France, so they didn't want to let them go. Algeria revolutionaries formed the National Liberation Front, the FLN, and women played an important role in the FLN. Women infiltrated French areas of Algeria, leaving time bombs in highly populated areas. The Battle of Algiers, 1954 to 1962. French forces played into the hands of the FLN. They started using violent tactics against them, like mass arrest, torture, and murder. Algerians actually their opinion started shifting towards them, and the rest of the world started giving them sympathy for it. So the French violence drove Algerian sympathy towards the FLN. Algeria received independence in 1962. Again, terrorism has won. The Mau Mau in Kenya from 1950 to 1960. Britain began to distribute Kenyans' agricultural areas to white British people, displacing tribes from ancestral lands. The Kikuyu were forced deep into western Kenya, and by 1950, the Kikuyu wanted violence, usually centered and called by the Mau Mau, which becoming a Mau Mau involved taking an oath. Revolts happened in agrarian areas, which is just agricultural areas. The Mau Mau suffered heavy losses, about 10,000 men, and Kenyans lost about 1,700. European losses were in dozens. To continue, rebel Kikuyus assembled in forests around 1950, burned European fields, hamstringed cattle, which is hitting them in the legs so they won't walk anymore. Small victories emboldened the Kikuyu, which they started doing little things like engaging into magical ceremonies, and this would actually create the Mau Mau movement. The Mau Mau revolutionaries began killing Kenyan loyalists and started entering European homesteads. They started growing more daring, and this changed by 1953. The Mau Mau insurgents entered a farmhouse of a popular farmer, slashed him to death with pangas, which are large blades. Also slashed to death his wife and 6-year-old son when they were trying to intervene. The event outraged European farmers, and the colonial government declared a state of emergency. Thousands of British soldiers arrived in Kenya. 90,000 suspected rebels were detained and tortured. The rebel violence dropped, but the government violence increased. The Mau Mau movement broke up into forest gangs as they were pushed back, and after summer of 1955, the Mau Mau were no more. Kenya gained its independence, and a former suspected Mau Mau, who was exiled, became president.
So I have Turkey, the part in the chapter that talks about Turkey. Just a brief history of Turkey real quick is Turkey is an enigma in its standing with Europe. It's 99% Muslim and was the home of the last caliphate. In 1453 became the center of Islam, and most of the country is in Asia, although Turkey was accepted as a partner in NATO and sought close trade ties with Europe and the United States after the World War II. It was the first Muslim majority country to recognize the state of Israel. Turkey looks to Europe for both cultural and economic reasons, and some Turkans agree and some disagree on this. So many Europeans and Americans encourage that Turkey looks up to these for cultural advice, hoping that Turkey will join the European Union, while other Europeans have been reluctant to accepting Turkey, citing its demographic, cultural, and religious differences. And they fear that if Turkey joins the EU, the European Union, that Europe will be flooded with poorly educated workers, and radical jihadists will straighten their foothold in Europe. They also worry about Turkey's human rights record. Turkey has many people who like the idea of blending religion, government. Other Turks are not enamored of this idea. In May 2007, 500,000 protested the influence of Islam Turkey's internal affairs. The Turkish army has declared that it will not accept a religious government. Turkey has attempted to modernize its law enforcement agencies and military within the norms of Western democracies. It has opened its doors to Western police agencies, and the Turkish National Police has one of the most highly educated police command staffs in the world. So Turkey has a terrorism struggle, or is struggling with terrorism. Turkey has suffered 40,000 deaths from terrorism since 1980. In the mid-1980s, a group known as the Turkish Hezbollah appeared in eastern Turkey. Hezbollah began to kidnap and torture Muslim business persons who refused to support its activities. The Hezbollah's goal is to establish an Islamic State by force of arms. These two people, Brian Williams and Fazia Altindag, point out that Turkey developed an international jihadist problem after 1994, and they believe that Hezbollah has a big part of this problem, that it's their fault that they have this problem. And they state that blowback or unwanted effects from the government's attempt to create. Hezbollah is a counter-terrorist movement against the Kurdistan Workers Party. But yet the real problem started in 1994 when several thousand Turkish young people began to attend militant madrasas or private religious schools in Pakistan. William and Altadog believe that the Pakistan-trained young men eventually became part of the jihadist movement in Turkey. By 2001, a group of madrasa-trained young men placed themselves under the leadership of Habib Aqdas, also known as Abu Anas al-Turki, the founder of Al-Qaeda in Turkey. He undertook tasks from the famous Osama bin Laden, who everybody knows. Bin Laden wanted to punish Turkey for the partnership that they had with the United States and Israel. He launched suicide attacks against 2 synagogues in Istanbul. The birds are chirping. On November 15, 2013. And 1 week later, he struck the British consulate and the British bank with suicide bombers. So these 2 attacks backfired on him because the Turkish National Police unleashed their full power against Al-Qaeda in Turkey, and a dozen of the Al-Qaeda operatives and supporters were arrested. So what Aqdas did was he went to go fight the Americans in Iraq, and he ended up being killed by the U.S. Airstrike in 2004. So as I mentioned before, the Kurdistan Workers Party, Turkey is currently facing a wave of religious terrorism. But for the past 3 decades, its major problem came from the Kurds, an ethnic group inhabiting parts of southern Turkey, northern Iraq, and northern Iran. The Kurdistan Workers Party, the PKK, is a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization composed of Turkish Kurds. It officially changed its name to the Kurdistan Freedom and Democracy, and its abbreviation is KADEK. It operates in Turkey and Europe, targeting Europeans, Turks, rival Kurds, and supporters of the Turkish government. So the PKK was founded in 1974 to fight for an independent Kurdistan. The PKK wanted to establish a Marxist-Leninist state. Although the PKK targeted Turkey, the Kurds claim a highland region spanning southeast Turkey, northeast Iraq, and northwest Iran. Taking advantage of the Kurdish nationalism and hoping to launch a guerrilla war, the PKK began operating in 1978. But they weren't strong enough to wage a guerrilla war without some type of support. And its political orientation prevented it from aligning with other Kurdish groups. So they pretty much had 2 choices, whether between throwing itself in terrorism, or it could wage in a propaganda campaign, and their leadership chose terrorism. So they're bad.
All right. On endemic ethnic terror in sub-Saharan Africa, and endemic terrorism is used to describe the state of terrorist violence in Africa. And the borders in much of sub-Saharan Africa and the modern Middle East were drawn in Europe without regard to the tribal area's ethnicity or religion. This resulted in rival groups and families being lumped together in a single new country, despite the fact they had no common history with it. And then politics in these states often became violent as factions fought for control of the government. And then conditions in Nigeria the British created the nation of Nigeria in 1845, and then in 1960, Nigeria gained its independence, and with that came 250 ethnic groups and 3 religious groupings, which were Muslims, Christians, and those who were adhering to traditional tribal religions. And Nigeria is now one of the poorest countries in the world, and are a hub for cybercrime, drug smuggling, human trafficking, piracy, violence, extremism, and disease. And Nigeria has like tremendous oil and gas reserve that generates millions of dollars. It's just the issue is that the wealth is controlled by small rival groups of political elites who prefer to see themselves get richer, while in fact they could help Nigeria's economy, but they won't. We're on the Boko Haram and Asaro. And the Boko Haram is one of the most militant Salafi groups in the world. Like their main types of misbehaviors: kidnapping, like rape, burned, bombed, and murdered thousands of people in the past decades. And it claims to be a part of the global jihadist movement and maintains loose connections with other militant groups. I mean, its main focus is the regional area, and then members subscribe to one or more of the 3 doctrines that they have, which is implementing Islamic law through all of Nigeria, providing rhetorical support for the transnational global jihad, and engaging in criminal activity, especially kidnapping for profit. Last one is Al-Shabaab's regional jihad, and Al-Shabaab is it's a product of a failed state. In 1991, revolutionaries overthrew long-term military dictator in Somalia, but never united to form a government. And so, being in the country where they had like a lot of clans, and the clans dominate social and political structures. And so, all of the clans competed and they ended up creating a powerful vacuum that was eventually filled by a host of local warlords. And then because of that, the United Nations made like several attempts to kind of restore order there, but were unsuccessful, which led them to create the transnational federal government, which is TFG. And then the TFG was designed to unite rival clans and rid the country of warlords. And that is
chapter 7.
it.
We're good.